Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we are going to review Bone Shield management. This includes the basic mechanics of Bone Shield, the cost of generating Bone Shield stacks, how to manage our Bone Shield stacks, and the concept of bad Morrowrens. First, let's look at the basic benefits of Bone Shield. Just having Bone Shield active provides a large armor buff and a 10% haste multiplier. The armor increase significantly reduces physical damage taken, while the haste bonus is also very significant. Additionally, when you have more than 5 stacks of Bone Shield, the cost of Death Strike is reduced by 5 runic power through Ossuary, which can significantly increase the number of Death Strikes we can use. Finally, if you are using the talent Foul Bulwark, Bone Shield provides a 1% increase to maximum health for each stack of Bone Shield, which is a respectable increase to our effective hit points. Foul Bulwark sees some play in difficult tank content as of patch 9.1, but it is not a commonly used talent. It is worth noting that, with the exception of Foul Bulwark, Bone Shield benefits do not get stronger when you have more than 5 stacks, so there is not a strong emphasis to keep your stack count at extremely high levels at all times. Now we will look at the mechanics associated with maintaining Bone Shield. Bone Shield is a stacking buff that lasts for 30 seconds after you have last gained a Bone Shield stack. You lose 1 stack of Bone Shield whenever a melee attack hits you, though losing Bone Shield attacks in this way has a 2.5-second internal cooldown. If you parry or dodge a melee attack, it cannot remove a stack of Bone Shield, but you can still lose stacks from attacks that are fully absorbed with absorbed shields. Bone Shield can only stack up to 10 at most, so any Bone Shield stacks generated beyond this point are wasted. Taken together, we need to actively generate Bone Shield stacks in order to maintain the buff in any situation, and it is possible to waste stacks if we are trying to generate Bone Shield above 10 stacks. Now that we have reviewed basic Bone Shield mechanics, we are going to talk about the trade-off involved with generating Bone Shield stacks and why we do not want to be wasteful with Bone Shield generation. The cost of Bone Shield has to do with how we usually generate Bone Shield stacks, which is by using Morrowind over our normal rune spending ability, Heartstrike. While Morrowind generates 3 stacks of Bone Shield and 20 runic power at the cost of 2 runes, Heartstrike generates 15 runic power at the cost of 1 rune. So, each Bone Shield stack is generated at the cost of 3 1/3 runic power in this situation. Not to mention the fact that 2 Heartstrikes are going to do more damage than a single Morrowind. So, how does this change with Dancing Rune Weapon? Interestingly enough, the math does not change much at all. Morrowind now generates 6 stacks of Bone Shield, and our Heartstrikes generate 20 runic power each. If we are not wasting any of the Bone Shield generation, the cost of Bone Shield charges remains the same as before. However, we generally will not be dropping below 5 stacks of Bone Shield, so, in reality, the cost of generating Bone Shield charges during Dancing Rune Weapon will likely be higher than what is displayed here. Heartbreaker, however, does change the math in a meaningful way, since the runic power generation of Heartstrike increases by up to 10 runic power without an increase in Bone Shield generation from Morrowind. If we assume 5 target cleave, the cost of Bone Shield charges can get as high as 10 runic power per stack, though even on single targets, Heartbreaker will make Bone Shield charges more expensive than they would be without Heartbreaker. If we have Heartbreaker talented in addition to Dancing Rune Weapon being active, we now see that Dancing Rune Weapon lowers the cost of Bone Shield charges relative to what they cost with Heartbreaker alone, and this difference is larger with more targets available. Even if you only manage to generate 5 Bone Shield stacks with a Morrowind, it will still be more efficient than a Morrowind outside of Dancing Rune Weapon, as long as you are hitting at least 2 targets with your Heartstrike. In any of these situations, the benefits of Bone Shield justify the cost of maintaining it. but it's important to keep these costs in mind when we start talking about wasted bone shield stacks and determining the value of other mechanics that generate bone shield stacks. Now that we have talked about the cost of bone shield generation, we will now look at how to manage our bone shield stacks. This should all be review, but when dealing with basic stack management, we are concerned with the following information in particular. Bone Shield has a refreshable 30-second duration. Benefits are mostly maximized at and above 5 stacks. We periodically lose Bone Shield stacks to melee attacks. 10 stacks of Bone Shield is the most we can have, and we can usually only generate Bone Shield stacks 3 stacks at a time with Morrowind. Taken together, we have the following objectives. First, we lose all of our Bone Shield stacks if Bone Shield's duration expires, so we want to Morrowind if we can prevent that from happening, ideally using this Morrowind as late as possible. Also, if you know you are about to enter a raid intermission where you will not have targets you can attack for a while, or if you are about to finish a pull in M+ with some walking distance to the next encounter, it can be worth refreshing your Bone Shield early before these downtime periods begin, so that Bone Shield will not expire during that downtime. Second, we always want to stay above 5 stacks of Bone Shield, so that our Death Strikes are 5 runic power cheaper, which is a significant benefit to us. We do not have full control over when we need to use Death Strike, so anytime we are under 5 stacks of Bone Shield, it increases the likelihood that we will waste runic power on more expensive Death Strikes. Third, we do not want to waste stack generation, because wasting Bone Shield stacks indirectly wastes runic power. As such, we do not want to use Morrowind above 7 stacks of Bone Shield ever, unless it will prevent the buff from expiring. Fourth, if we are using Foul Bulwark, we would prefer to maximize the amount of Bone Shield stacks we have for the extra effective hit points. So, when do we want to Morrowind? With the exception of the first objective, which only comes into play when we are not being meleeed frequently, the rest of the objectives deal with managing stack count. If we do not want to lose Ossuary, and we do not want to waste Bone Shield generation, we have the option of trying to use Morrowind on 5, 6, or 7 stacks of Bone Shield. With Foul Bulwark talented, we are given an extra incentive to use Morrowind at 7 stacks, but otherwise, we need to think about the consequences for targeting different stack counts. In general, higher stacks means that we have more time to use other abilities before we lose our Ossuary bonus, since it will take at least 2.5 seconds to lose each stack of Bone Shield. So, we will be less likely to lose runic power from Ossuary if we are regularly maintaining higher stacks. Having more time also means we could purposefully delay Morrowending if we are in a situation where our Heart Strikes or other rotational abilities are especially valuable, though fully benefiting from this requires strong execution of our ability rotation. However, maintaining higher stacks of Bone Shield makes it harder to utilize sources of Bone Shield generation that provide more than 3 Bone Shield stacks at a time, such as Morrowending when Dancing Rune Weapon is active. Additionally, if we need to refresh Bone Shield because the duration is expiring and not because our Bone Shield stacks are getting low, having higher stacks will result in more wasted Bone Shield generation on average. Not to mention the fact that having your Bone Shield expire will result in more waste if you had more stacks at the time that the Bone Shield buff expired. So, Bone Shield generation is more likely to be wasted when we are maintaining higher stacks. Taken together, we are looking at a trade-off between minimizing runic power losses from Ossuary and rotational flexibility, or minimizing Bone Shield losses by making it easier to efficiently generate Bone Shield stacks without wasting them. Going back to the question of when we want to Morrowind, unless you have an explicit reason to be waiting until 5 stacks of Bone Shield, it is not generally recommended to wait this long to Morrowind, since you have to react very quickly before you start losing Ossuary uptime, and you do not have much rotational flexibility when your stacks get low at all. Remember, you can go from 5 to 4 stacks of Bone Shield in as little as 2.5 seconds in a worst case scenario. Instead, aiming to refresh on 6 stacks is a good basic recommendation, since the extra stack of Bone Shield provides more than enough reaction time for the average user, while still doing a good job at minimizing Bone Shield waste. Refreshing on 7 stacks can be good if you are running Foul Bulwark or if you are able to leverage the extra flexibility it gives you to make your rotation more efficient, though it requires more effort to see the full benefits of running at higher stacks and your Bone Shield waste potential is higher, especially if you are using options that give you additional sources of Bone Shield generation. Next, we will go over extra mechanics that affect Bone Shield management, starting with Dancing Rune Weapon. As we have previously discussed, Dancing Rune Weapon causes our Morrowrens to generate 6 Bone Shield stacks while it is active, instead of the usual 3. And if we are regularly Morrowrending somewhere between 5 and 7 stacks of Bone Shield, we are going to be wasting Bone Shield stacks whenever we Morrowrend without rotational modifications. However, Simcraft analysis suggests it is not worth intentionally dropping below 5 stacks of Bone Shield for any significant amount of time in order to line up a 6-stack Morrowind, unless you are being unrealistically precise with your ability timings. And even when we are using Heartbreaker, which makes Dancing Rune Weapon more efficient for Bone Shield generation, it is never worth using Morrowind at or above 6 stacks of Bone Shield with Dancing Rune Weapon unless you are preventing your Bone Shield from expiring. So, what do we do to improve this situation? Regardless of our talents, the answer remains the same. We want to avoid Mara Rending during Dancing Rune Weapon unless we are at 5 Bone Shield stacks or our stacks are about to expire. The Crimson Rune Weapon Legendary throws another wrench into our normal Bone Shield management, because it makes Dancing Rune Weapon generate 5 Bone Shield stacks when cast. If we just throw this into our normal rotation, we will likely lose Bone Shield charges every time we use Dancing Rune Weapon. Similar to Morrowind's during Dancing Rune Weapon, Simcraft analysis suggests it is not worth intentionally dropping below 5 stacks of Bone Shield for any significant amount of time to support this legendary, unless your timings are unrealistically precise. Additionally, Dancing Rune Weapon is a powerful cooldown, especially with Crimson Rune Weapon, so it is not much of a surprise that Simcraft indicates that holding the ability until we drop to 5 stacks of Bone Shield is not worth the cost of lost Dancing Rune Weapon casts for either mitigation or damage throughput. So, if you are in a situation where Dancing Rune Weapon will gain value as a defensive cooldown, you are often better off just using Dancing Rune Weapon and accepting the Bone Shield generation losses than waiting for your Bone Shield stacks to go down to 5 or less. So, what can we do to improve this situation? Well, we ideally want to coast down to as close to 5 Bone Shield stacks as possible without falling below 5 stacks of Bone Shield right before we want to use Dancing Rune Weapon. If we were just looking for a simple solution, we could use a lower Bone Shield band all the time, such as always targeting 5 or 6 Bone Shield charges before using Morrowind instead of 6 or 7. This solution is not free, but it will reduce Bone Shield waste from using Crimson Rune Weapon. Alternatively, we could target lower levels of Bone Shield when Dancing Rune Weapon's cooldown is below a certain threshold, while using higher levels outside of that window. This is more complicated to do, but it is technically the better solution if you can execute it well. For example, Simcraft analysis suggests that switching from a normal Bone Shield threshold of 7 to a Bone Shield threshold of 5 when Dancing Rune Weapon's cooldown reaches the halfway point will minimize Bone Shield waste from Crimson Rune Weapon while allowing you to maintain a higher average Bone Shield stack count than using a threshold of 5 all the time. But feel free to use whatever works for you. Abomination Limb from the Necrolord Covenant is another option that impacts our Bone Shield generation. It generates 3 Bone Shield stacks when initially used, 3 Bone Shield stacks 6 seconds later, and 3 more Bone Shield stacks 12 seconds after the initial cast. Even if we do not waste the initial 3 Bone Shield charges, we are likely to see wasted stacks at the 6 or 12-second generation points, since it takes us at least 2.5 seconds to lose a Bone Shield charge, and Abomination Limb is generating an average of 1 stack every 2 seconds after the initial 3 stacks are generated. Even when used at 5 stacks of Bone Shield, it is not guaranteed that stack generation will not be wasted, since it often takes longer than 2.1 seconds to actually lose Bone Shield stacks. Despite this, it still is not worth purposefully dropping below 5 stacks to improve stack generation efficiency, which is similar to the previous options. However, with Abomination Limb specifically, it is worth waiting for your Bone Shield charges to go down to 5 before using Abomination Limb, unless you are in a situation where you really need the Death Grips from Abomination Limb, or if you are in a situation where your Bone Shield stacks are not dropping at the regular rate for whatever reason. So, what can we do to improve this situation? The methods for reducing waste on Abomination Limb are similar to what we could do with Crimson Rune Weapon. We can either sit at relatively lower bone shield stacks all the time to keep things simple, or you can adjust to lower bone shield thresholds when Abomination Limb's remaining cooldown gets low. In the case of Abomination Limb in particular, Simcraft analysis suggests that you minimize losses if you swap to lower levels of Bone Shield at least 20 seconds before Abomination Limb comes off of cooldown. It is also important to note that unless you are below 5 stacks of Bone Shield, make sure you are not using Morrowind while your Abomination Limb is active and still generating Bone Shield charges. So, what happens if you are using both Crimson Rune Weapon and Abomination Limb? Other than following the individual guidance for both, you want to use Dancing Rune Weapon over Abomination Limb when both are available, since Dancing Rune Weapon is the more valuable cooldown. You even want to avoid using Abomination Limb if you are expecting Dancing Rune Weapon to come off of cooldown in the next 5 seconds, and you are expecting to use it immediately. Granted, if you are starting a pull at 0 Bone Shield stacks, you can use both abilities back to back and get effective Bone Shield generation from both of them. In any case, some of the individual benefits of Crimson Rune Weapon and Abomination Limb will be lost when they are used together, even when optimally managed. There is a limit to how much Bone Shield generation we can make use of, so the Bone Shield waste of both of these options used together is going to be more than the combined waste from each used individually. Tombstone will not be covered in this video because it is extremely situational, hard to use, and players just do not like using it, to the point where even if a situation came up where Tombstone was the correct choice, you are still unlikely to ever see anyone using it. If this situation changes in the future, I may do a section about it, but right now I'm not going to spend the time. Now that we've talked about stack management, we will now go over the concept of bad Morrowrens. Bad Morrowrens, similar to bad Death Strikes, are a relatively common performance issue. A bad Morrowrend generally refers to a Morrowrend used with more than 7 stacks of Bone Shield, so that at least one of the Bone Shield stacks generated from a normal Morrowrend is wasted. And, as we talked about earlier, any wasted Bone Shield stacks are effectively wasted runic power and damage. If you are trying to improve as a Blood Death Knight, minimizing bad Morrowrens is an important part of playing optimally, and it is something to be aware of. The only situation where these high stack Morrowrens are justifiable is if you are using a Morrowrend to prevent your Bone Shield stacks from expiring. In total, this video reviewed the mechanics associated with Bone Shield, the cost of Bone Shield, how to manage Bone Shield, and the concept of bad Morrowrens. If this content was helpful to you, or if there are any additional topics you would like to see, leave a comment below or contact me through Discord. My information can be found in the video description below. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.